1. Billy Shamirmir. He was known as Billy Kipkorir Shamirmir, approximately 50 years old at the time of his arrest, and had worked as a caregiver in the home healthcare industry. Originally from Kenya, he portrayed himself as a trusted aide to elderly women, someone offering comfort and assistance. On the surface, he appeared steady, a dedicated worker, courteous and reliable in neighborhoods where seniors lived independently. To families, he seemed like a helper, a dependable presence in a vulnerable time of life. Underneath, the circumstances that triggered his crimes remain murky. There is no well-documented history of childhood trauma or diagnosed mental illness, and no public record of significant emotional instability. What may have shifted the course of his life appears tied to the opportunity he found access to elderly residents and their valuables. As reports later revealed, he targeted affluent older women, suggesting a motive rooted more in greed than in profound psychological disturbance. Between 2016 and 2018, residents in independent senior living communities, especially those in the Dallas area, began dying under suspicious circumstances. Many of these older women were initially assumed to have died of natural causes because of their age. Their deaths raised little alarm, but the pattern became impossible to ignore when one 91-year-old woman survived an attack. She had been smothered with a pillow, but managed to escape and reported the incident to police. Investigators soon connected the dots and arrested Shamirmir. Police found him the following day in his apartment complex parking lot in possession of jewelry and cash. A large red jewelry box discovered nearby contained documents that linked him to the home of 81-year-old Lou T. Harris, where she had been found dead in her bedroom. He was indicted on 22 counts of capital murder. However, prosecutors ultimately dropped charges in some jurisdictions after he received 2 convictions. He was convicted for the smothering death of 81-year-old Lou T. Harris in a retrial, and later convicted in the slaying of 87-year-old Mary Brooks. With convictions in 2 separate cases, he received 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole, one for each conviction. Prosecutors decided not to pursue the death penalty. Public reaction was intense. Families of victims were both relieved and shaken as they faced the man who had brought grief to their lives. In court, one daughter displayed 2 photographs of her mother, one alive, the other after her death, when Shamirmir had forced personal jewelry from her finger, a haunting image that captured the emotional weight of the crimes. Psychologists and experts have suggested that his motivations were rooted in opportunism and financial gain rather than delusional constructs or emotion-driven impulses. There is no public record of in-depth psychological evaluations made available, but the pattern impersonating a caregiver, targeting wealthy elderly individuals in their homes, smothering with pillows, points to a calculated, chilling efficiency. He met an abrupt end behind bars. On September 19, 2023, he was found dead in his cell at the Caulfield unit in rural East Texas, attacked by his cellmate Wyatt Busby, who stabbed and beat him to death with a knife-like instrument. This occurred amid a statewide prison lockdown prompted by a rise in inmate-on-inmate homicides. His death is now under investigation by the state's Office of the Inspector General. In closing, these crimes stand as an unambiguous betrayal of trust and a profound violation of the vulnerable. This is not a story of sympathy. It is a reminder of the devastation wrought when someone who should have offered care instead inflicted harm. The legacy of his actions cannot be justified or softened. It must serve as a solemn warning and a call to protect those most unable to protect themselves. 2. Nathaniel Burkett. He was known as Nathaniel Burkett. Around 74 years old at his death, and in his later years he had no official occupation. Born in rural Mississippi in the mid-1940s, Burkett spent his early life struggling with polio, a disease that he hinted left him walking with a limp. Though little is publicly known about his childhood, that physical challenge earned him the nickname Crypto. He migrated between Mississippi and Las Vegas for decades. For most, he went unnoticed, a man who kept to himself without close family or a visible social circle. His outward image was quiet, unremarkable, a drifter between 2 worlds, never drawing attention until the grim truth surfaced. There is limited public record of psychological triggers, no prior diagnosis of mental illness or documented trauma beyond his childhood illness. Yet, the long span of his offenses stretching from the late 1970s into the early 2000s suggests a pattern hidden beneath the surface. It may have been his solitude, perhaps a sense of invisibility that emboldened him. Each crime might have deepened his detachment from society. What began as an act and might have gone undetected grew into a pattern over time, fueled by opportunity and anonymity. His crimes unfolded across decades. Beginning in 1978 and continuing intermittently through 2002, he claimed the lives of multiple women in the Las Vegas Valley, and years earlier he took the life of his own mother in Mississippi, though only decades later would the full scope become clear. The murders often involved women who may not have known him personally, adding to the disturbing sense of betrayal of ordinary life. His methods aligned with someone who moved among the shadows, striking where he could, leaving confusion and grief in his wake. Precise details remain sparse, but a sense emerges of a man who preyed on vulnerability in the anonymity of the urban landscape. Investigation advanced only when modern forensic science caught up. In July 2012, investigators finally connected several cold cases to Burkett through DNA analysis, a breakthrough that began to piece together a decades-long puzzle. Prosecutors brought him to trial, and in 2018 he was convicted of 3 counts of murder. The courtroom revealed a man who had evaded suspicion for so long only to be undone by the persistence of justice and advancements in forensic investigation. The legal consequences were years in prison. His life effectively ended behind bars, while families of victims learned to live with the weight of answers finally delivered. Psychological profiles were not widely published, but experts suggested that his motivation may have been rooted in the bleakness of obscurity and the thrill of avoiding detection. There was no evidence of political or ideological intent. His crimes appear driven by anonymity, by becoming a ghost, walking among ordinary lives, then committing acts that shattered them. His polio-related limp, his silence, his migratory existence may have fed a sense of power in being unseen, then striking. This is not a story that invites sympathy. Instead, it stands as a stark lesson: when criminal justice lags behind the sharp rise of modern tools, justice can still prevail, though often far too late. His decades of violence took lives, shattered families, and left scars across 2 states. He must be remembered not for his quietness, but for the devastation he wrought. The crimes he committed cannot be excused or softened under talk of illness or neglect. They demand our unwavering condemnation and our determination to protect those who might otherwise vanish unnoticed. Let this be a call to never forget the victims, and to harness every tool to bring closure to those who suffer. 3. Henry Louis Wallace. He was Henry Louis Wallace, about 28 years old at the time of his arrest, and worked as a fast food restaurant manager, most notably at a Taco Bell in Charlotte, North Carolina. Born in Barnwell, South Carolina, he was raised by a single mother who worked long hours in a textile mill and who was verbally critical and harsh. In high school, he served on the student council and was the sole male cheerleader, but beneath that public success lay isolation and early emotional damage. After graduation, he joined the Navy, married his high school sweetheart, and was honorably discharged, but by then he had developed a crack cocaine habit and had a criminal record for burglary. There is evidence that early life circumstances and abuse may have shaped some of his behavior. His mother's persistent criticism and emotional abuse, combined with drug use and failure to meet probation obligations, suggest a confluence of instability and escalating desperation. Psychologists at his trial described him as deeply troubled, remarking on his pattern of burning evidence but sometimes forgetting to actually ignite the flames. Between 1990 and 1994, he raped and strangled 11 black women, 10 in Charlotte, and one earlier victim in South Carolina. Most of the women were in their late teens to mid-20s, and many were someone he knew, friends, co-workers, or acquaintances, especially through his workplace at fast food restaurants. He even attended some of their funerals, an act that shocked friends and families. Law enforcement did not initially recognize a serial pattern. Until March 1994, the killings appeared sporadic. That changed when he murdered 2 women in the same apartment complex on consecutive days, making the connection unavoidable. A 3rd murder followed quickly, and police launched a full-scale investigation. Investigators were already under strain with limited staffing and heavy caseloads, and Wallace's sweeping cleanup of crime scenes frustrated initial efforts. He was arrested on March 12, 1994, and confessed to 11 killings that day, detailing each crime to investigators. The breadth of his admissions and the precision with which he recounted each victim's appearance and manner of death confirmed his guilt. At trial, prosecutors sought the death penalty. His defense argued mental illness, citing childhood abuse, but the jury convicted him of 9 counts of first-degree murder in January 1997, and he received 9 death sentences. His appeals failed in both North Carolina's Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court. He remains on death row at Central Prison in Raleigh. Experts and family members noted that Wallace's crimes seemed rooted in a twisted blend of trust and manipulation. He portrayed himself as a caring friend or confidant, drawing in victims through familiarity before betraying that trust. One prosecutor described him as the perfect human predator, able to move among communities unnoticed before striking. His crimes demand unequivocal condemnation. He destroyed the lives of young black women who trusted him, and he exploited their vulnerability and confidence. There is no excuse for his actions, no mitigation in the pain inflicted. His behavior was calculated, cruel, and utterly unforgivable. Let this narrative serve as a solemn reminder: trust can be weaponized, and even someone known and welcomed can become a devastating threat. Justice, though delayed, was ultimately served, but the loss remains profound, and the memory of the victims must stand as a call to vigilance, dignity, and unwavering responsibility to protect the vulnerable. For Roberta Elder. She was Roberta Elder, likely born in 1907 to 1909, and at the time of her trial she was held in Georgia State Prison, serving a life sentence. She lived in the Atlanta area and was married to Reverend William M. Elder, a respected Baptist minister who also worked as a construction worker. She raised his 5 children in their blended household. To neighbors, she seemed like a devoted wife and caregiver, tending to her family's needs in a modest, church-going environment. The chain of tragedies that may have triggered suspicion began quietly. Between 1938 and 1952, several family members, including 2 daughters, a grandson, her mother, a cousin, and 2 ex-husbands died under unclear circumstances, often attributed to pneumonia or other natural causes. There is little evidence of psychological trauma or instability in her past, but the accumulation of deaths in her household suggests long-term premeditation rather than random misfortune. In 1952, her husband, Reverend William Elder, fell ill after eating bananas and cheese allegedly at work. He returned home, and Roberta cared for him, administering remedies like milk of magnesia. But when his condition worsened, a doctor arrived and noticed unusual symptoms: reddened skin and emaciation, prompting the coroner to test for arsenic poisoning. The same coroner had handled the deaths of 2 daughters just months earlier. The decision to test proved pivotal. Exhumations of the children revealed arsenic in their hair. Investigators discovered that Roberta had taken out life insurance policies in each victim's name, especially sizable ones on her husband and stepdaughter, linking financial motive to the pattern of deaths. Witnesses also recounted seeing a pink powder in the household, which Roberta claimed was insecticide from her brother's farm. Investigators suspected it to be arsenic used to poison food or remedies. Attention turned from suspicion to accusation. Roberta was arrested in September 1952. She stood trial for the murder of Reverend Elder. Though the evidence was largely circumstantial, it was compelling insurance policies, exhumation results, and witness accounts of the pink powder. She maintained her innocence throughout, but the jury convicted her. Because the prosecution relied on circumstantial evidence, the death penalty was unavailable under Georgia law. She received a life sentence instead. Psychologists were not publicly quoted in detail, but Roberta came to embody a calculated betrayal masquerading as care. She exploited her role as caregiver to those closest to her, betraying trust for personal gain. The label of Atlanta's Misses. Bluebeard, or Mrs. Bluebird, echoed this betrayal, referencing a version of the fairy tale figure who kills those closest in a domestic setting. Despite being one of the rare documented black female serial killers, her case received limited mainstream media coverage, largely going unmentioned outside black press publications. These crimes must not be misremembered as tragedy without accountability. The deaths of children, a spouse, and other relatives at the hands of someone entrusted to care for them are heartbreaking and reprehensible. Roberta Elder's actions had a devastating impact on families and communities. Her manipulation of both domestic intimacy and financial instruments to commit multiple murders demands unequivocal condemnation. There is no justification for her betrayal of trust, no empathy appropriate for someone who turned caregiving into a weapon. Her victims deserve remembrance, and this cautionary tale stands as a solemn reminder that evil can hide in the most familiar places, and that justice, however delayed, must be pursued relentlessly. 5. Collins Jumisi Kalushia. He was Collins Jumisi Kalushia, approximately 33 years old at the time of his arrest, and had worked as a motorcycle taxi driver in Nairobi. Born in Vihiga County, Kenya, he later moved with his mother and siblings to Migori County after his father's death. On the surface, he lived an ordinary life, renting a modest room not far from a local dump site in Nairobi's slum areas. There were no outward signs of violence or public disturbance. He was in the eyes of his neighbors unremarkable and largely unnoticed. What may have driven him into a pattern of horrific violence is shrouded in uncertainty. Authorities described him as a psychopathic serial killer with no respect for human life, a statement reflecting the chilling nature of his alleged actions but without detailed information about his psychological state. There is no public record of diagnosed mental illness or overt trauma, only the disturbing escalation from caregiving communities to claiming dozens of lives. Between 2022 and mid-2024, the remains of multiple women began appearing near the Quare dump in Nairobi. Many were discovered within nylon sacks wrapped and discarded in what investigators recognized as a distressing pattern. The victims ranged in age from late teens to around 30 years old. The first known victim was his own wife, whom he confessed to having killed and disposed of in that same location. The police also reported recovering belongings from his rented room, including multiple mobile phones, SIM cards, identification cards, nylon sacks, gloves, and a machete that tied him directly to the site and the victims. The investigation advanced when police tracked a mobile money transaction using one of the victims' phones. That led them to a club where Kalushia had gone to watch the European Soccer Championship final. He was arrested in the early morning hours and, following his apprehension, admitted to luring, killing, and disposing of 42 women, including his wife. In court proceedings, the head of Kenya's Directorate of Criminal Investigations labeled him a vampire and psychopath, underlining the lack of regard for human life observed in his alleged crimes. His arrest generated national shock, particularly because many of the remains had been discovered near a police station, a proximity that raised concerns about oversight and accountability. Human rights organizations and the Police Oversight Authority began inquiries into whether police negligence or worse had allowed the killings to continue unchecked. The case took another turn when in August 2024, Kalushia escaped from Nairobi's Jijiri police station along with 12 detainees. The escape, discovered during a routine check in the early morning, was believed to have been aided by insiders, leading to disciplinary measures against 8 officers believed to be complicit. It is no solace to label him and return to headlines. These deaths represent real human loss. This is not forgiveness nor explanation. This is accountability. Collins Jumisi Kalushia's alleged crimes betrayed the most basic trust society extends to familiar faces. His actions inflicted incalculable harm on families and communities and shattered the illusion that danger always strikes from the unknown. Let the memory of the victims be a call for vigilance, justice, and unwavering protection. There is no justification for what he is accused of, only a moral imperative to ensure that such cruelty is never repeated, and that justice, though delayed, is pursued fully. 6. Anthony Eugene Robinson. He was Anthony Eugene Robinson, around 38 years old at the time of his conviction, and worked in waste management and related services while often living without a permanent home. Before the crimes came to light, he was known to drift among cities like Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, largely under the radar with a remarkable absence of any criminal history. There was no outward sign of threat or violence, just a man blending into life's margins. What fueled his descent into a pattern of calculated violence remains murky. There is no public record of diagnosed mental illness or documented trauma. Yet, his actions suggest a chilling detachment. Authorities described him as a predator preying upon loneliness and trust, especially when encountering vulnerable women on dating platforms. Beginning in late 2021, bodies of women began appearing in vacant lots across Virginia and the D.C. area, transported in shopping carts discarded beside motels or empty fields. The deaths of at least 4 women, Aline Beth Redman, Tanita Loris Smith Cheyenne Brown, and Stephanie Harrison, shared a haunting pattern. Robinson allegedly met each woman via dating sites, lured them to motels, and then disposed of their bodies using a shopping cart, his signature method. Investigators called him the shopping cart killer in response to this brutal and methodical pattern. One woman, Monica White, of Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, survived her time with Robinson. She had connected with him through a dating app, and early interactions started as normal, but soon she noticed deeply unsettling behavior. He tried to tie her up, acted controlling, and even urinated in her bed. She ended the relationship and later recognized him in the news after his arrest, worrying that her rejection may have ignited his rage. Investigators built their case using surveillance footage and cell phone data. Videos showed victims entering hotel rooms with Robinson, and later him exiting with a shopping cart loaded with a large wrapped object presumed to be a body. He was arrested on November 23, 2021, after tracking revealed patterns connecting him to multiple victims across state lines. At trial in early 2025, prosecutors presented a strong case. Robinson was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated murder, and 2 counts of concealing a body. The jury deliberated less than an hour before delivering guilty verdicts and recommended the maximum penalties. Victims' families spoke with raw emotion, describing irreplaceable loss grief and the shattered memory of loved ones. The jury also recommended 4 life sentences plus additional years for concealment along with a substantial fine. Final sentencing is scheduled for September 2025. Psychological experts noted that Robinson's motives appeared rooted in dehumanization and control. He targeted women seeking connection and turned that trust into a trap. There was no public record of a legitimate insanity defense evaluations found him criminally sane and therefore fully accountable for his actions. His crimes must stand denounced. Robinson created a false sense of intimacy before delivering unspeakable acts of betrayal and violence. These women, and Monica White, fortunate enough to escape, deserve our attention, our memory, and our unwavering commitment to justice. This narrative is not about understanding or forgiving. It is about holding accountable someone who chose to exploit trust. The impact on victims, families, and communities is irreparable. Let their memory be a solemn call to vigilance, compassion, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. 7. Keith Gibson. He was Keith Gibson, approximately 41 years old at the time of his sentencing, who worked intermittently but had a long criminal record, ending up drifting between Delaware and Philadelphia. Born in 1982 to a teenage mother and raised in a struggling urban area, he was the only son and grew up without a father. His mother later became a social worker, but he showed little interest in school and instead became entangled in petty crime. He was prosecuted repeatedly during his youth, and by 2008 he was convicted of manslaughter and a weapons charge and sentenced to a 20-year term, which became the backdrop for the wave of terrible events that followed. His early release and supervision set the stage. Paroled, in June 2020 he was released under strict conditions, barred from leaving Delaware, and required to check in regularly. Despite warnings that 6.5 years of his sentence remained, he served only a month before being released back into the community. Then, in 2021, a chain of violent crimes began. In mid-May, he entered a Metro PCS store in Ellesmere, Delaware, and killed clerk Leslie Ruiz Basilio during a robbery, stealing her vehicle in a crime captured on surveillance footage. Less than a month later, he killed Ronald Wright in a street robbery in Wilmington. In the following days, he assaulted or robbed several others, including a clerk who survived by feigning death. Surrounding states noticed a mounting pattern of violence. His arrest came on June 8, 2021, during an armed robbery of a Rite Aid. During that incident, a clerk passed him a bundle of money, rigged with a GPS tracker. He was found wearing body armor and carrying a revolver ammunition and a knife. Investigators quickly linked the weapon to the prior murders using ballistic evidence. In November 2023, a jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder and a host of additional charges including attempted murder, armed robbery conspiracy, and weapon offenses totaling 25 convictions. Then, in March 2024, the court declared him a habitual offender and sentenced him to 7 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus almost 300 years in prison. He remains charged for 4 additional Philadelphia killings, including the murder of his own mother, a Dunkin' shop manager, and 2 men in Germantown cases that will be heard in Pennsylvania when proceedings resume. Though no detailed psychological profile has been published, his actions suggest a calculated abandonment of human empathy marked by disregard for life and civil norms. He exploited familiar routines and settings, stores, streets, family trust to unleash chaos. His criminal history and disruption suggest a pattern of escalating violence that society failed to contain in time. These crimes demand unequivocal condemnation. Keith Gibson betrayed every expectation of rehabilitation and imposed profound grief on communities, families, and colleagues of his victims. His choices cannot be softened by talk of parole or prior convictions. They must stand as stark warnings of negligence and the human cost of systemic failures. Let this tale remain lodged not in sensationalism but as an urgent call for vigilance, accountability, and unyielding justice for those who cannot speak for themselves. 8. Samuel Little. He was Samuel Little, about 74 years old, when law enforcement began formally linking him to a cascade of unsolved murders. And he had no ongoing occupation, spending years drifting, occasionally arrested for petty crimes. Born as Samuel McDowell in Reynolds, Georgia, to a teenage mother and raised by his grandmother in Ohio, his early life was marked by abandonment and instability. His public image was nondescript, a man who navigated the margins, seldom drawing attention until law enforcement finally confronted him with the truth that would shock the nation. What triggered his crimes remains elusive in public records. There is no clear history of mental illness or emotional instability, yet decades of unchecked violence suggest a disturbing breakdown. He appeared to choose victim society, often ignored vulnerable women who might not be missed immediately. Experts now believe that his crimes went unnoticed for so long because the victims were marginalized. His crimes spanned from roughly 1970 to 2005, during which he confessed to stranding the lives of 93 women across multiple states, each typically strangled. Many of the deaths had been ruled as accidental or unexplained. Only after years did connections begin to form. His method often remained under the radar, utilizing a controlled attack rather than overt violence. Initially, he was arrested in 2012 on drug charges in Kentucky. Los Angeles police matched his DNA to 3 unsolved killings from the late 80s, prompting a broader investigation. Over time, a dedicated Texas Ranger, James Holland, conducted more than 700 hours of interviews with Samuel Little, gradually coaxing him into confessing to his disturbing ledger of crimes. The FBI's VICAP Violent Criminal Apprehension Program collaborated with the Texas Rangers and local authorities to verify his admissions. As of October 2019, 50 of his confessions had been confirmed, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history. Many more remain under investigation. In 2014, he stood trial in Los Angeles for 3 murders, and the evidence against him backed by DNA and testimonies led to a conviction. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He died in late 2020 while serving his sentence, closing the chapter on the man but not the questions surrounding his crimes. Experts who studied his case emphasized that his victims were often women on society's fringes, those whose disappearances attracted little attention. His ability to act undetected for decades reflected systemic failures. Investigators hope that matching his detailed confessions to cold cases can still bring closure to some of their bereaved families. This story is a solemn reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, especially when victims are marginalized. There can be no compassion for one who manipulated empathy, lived undetected, and crushed lives without remorse. His crimes demand condemnation, and the memory of his victims must fuel our commitment to vigilance, justice, and a society attentive to every missing voice. Let their names echo as a warning and their truth as a demand for accountability. 9. Maury Troy Travis. He was Maury Troy Travis, around 36 years old at the time of his arrest, and worked as a hotel waiter. Paroled from prison in 2000 after a conviction for armed robbery, he lived in Ferguson, a quiet suburb of St. Louis, Missouri. Friends and neighbors described him as polite and industrious, someone who held a steady job and kept a low profile. No one suspected that behind the surface calm he was harboring a deep-seated darkness. What compelled him to target sex workers in such brutal ways remains unclear. There is no public record of mental illness or childhood trauma. Yet, over the course of approximately 2 years from 2000 to 2002, he preyed on vulnerable women whose lives were often marginalized. His behavior points to cold calculation more than impulsive rage, a desire to dominate, to control, and to remain hidden under the cover of familiarity. During that period, investigators linked him to at least 12 murders, although in letters he confessed to murdering as many as 17, and some law enforcement officials suspected he may have had up to 20 victims. His known victims, often black women working in the sex trade, were lured to his home, strangled, and subsequently discarded along remote roads in and around St. Louis and East St. Louis. The turning point in the investigation came when a local newspaper ran a profile on one victim. He responded by sending an anonymous letter and a computer-generated map marked with an X, guiding authorities to the location of another body. The map was traced back to a download from a travel website which led investigators to his home in Ferguson. When police executed the search warrant, they discovered a horror hidden behind an ordinary facade, a basement that served as a makeshift torture chamber, a room outfitted with bondage equipment, a stun gun, bloodstains, and videotapes documenting his crimes. The tapes were so distressing that officers who viewed them were offered counseling afterward. He was arrested on June 7, 2002, and charged under federal complaint with at least 2 murders. However, he died by suicide in his jail cell just 3 days later. Although he was on suicide watch, 2 consecutive checks by guards were missed, granting him enough time to take his own life. Without a trial, the full truth died with him. Though police confirmed 12 murders and believed there could be many more, justice was never served in court. Families of victims were left with painful questions, some unable to recover their loved ones' remains or to find closure. Experts say his crimes underscore a chilling lesson that evil can hide behind unremarkable lives, especially when victims are overlooked by society. He exploited societal indifference toward marginalized people and relied on technology to taunt authorities until digital traces traced him back. There is no justification for his actions, and no empathy warranted for someone who turned intimacy and domesticity into instruments of violence. His case serves as a solemn warning: vigilance matters even in quiet suburbs. We must challenge the assumptions that some lives are less worthy and ensure that every disappearance is met with urgency, not dismissal. Maury Travis remains a name that demands condemnation, a reminder that true responsibility means recognizing humanity where others fail to see it, and refusing to allow darkness to hide in plain sight. 10. Eddie Lee Mosley. He was Eddie Lee Mosley, about 73 years old at the time of his death, and had no official occupation, his life marked by repeated institutionalization rather than stability. Born in 1947 in Fort Lauderdale as the third of 10 children, he faced chronic respiratory problems from birth, along with early signs of intellectual disability and memory issues. Schools became inhospitable. He dropped out in the third grade around 1960, and his learning struggles and antisocial behavior soon led him into a cycle of low-wage labor punctuated by arrests. He became infamously known in Fort Lauderdale's northwest neighborhoods during the 1970s and 80s as the Rape Man, a disturbing local legend whispered among vulnerable communities. Authorities now believe he was responsible for dozens of rapes and an estimated 8 to 16 murders, though some suggest his involvement may extend farther. The crimes followed a chilling pattern. Mosley targeted women, many in marginalized communities, and used common articles like bras or socks as instruments in his assaults, often strangling survivors or victims. The brutality was always calculated, and his proximity to victims' homes allowed him to strike without detection. Publicly, there were wrongful convictions. Two men, Frank Lee Smith and Jerry Frank Townsend, both intellectually disabled, served long sentences for murders Mosley committed. Only after DNA testing years later were they exonerated. Despite suspicion from law enforcement earlier, he was first institutionalized in 1974 after being ruled mentally incompetent. After years in a state hospital, he was released in summer 1979, and the wave of rapes and murders began almost immediately afterward. Investigators had identified Mosley as a prime suspect based on eyewitness accounts and shoe print evidence, but internal resistance and procedural failures kept him free while innocent men were prosecuted. In 1987, Mosley was finally pinpointed by forensic evidence. Blood type and semen samples matched years-old crime scene evidence. He was arrested in May 1987, and under intense interrogation he provided conflicting accounts before inconsistently admitting to crimes. His IQ was measured at about 51, well below average, which led to a judicial ruling that he remained incompetent to stand trial. He was recommitted to mental health care in a state psychiatric facility. In 2001, advances in DNA testing finally revealed his true extent. Investigators linked his DNA to murders, including that of a young child, leading prosecutors to vacate wrongful convictions of Townsend and Smith. Smith, however, had already died in prison before the truth emerged. Mosley spent the rest of his life cycling through psychiatric institutions. Declared a model patient, he even earned supervised hospital leaves. In spring 2020, he fell ill with pneumonia and tested positive for COVID-19. He died in a Florida hospital in May 2020, still never having faced trial for his crimes. His case is a harrowing lesson in systemic failure where vulnerable victims, flawed investigations, and over-reliance on coerced testimonies led to decades of injustice. There can be no sympathy for a man who destroyed lives, misled justice, and remained untouched by accountability. But there is a moral imperative to honor the memory of forgotten victims, demand rigorous investigation regardless of social status, and never let negligence mask brutality. Eddie Lee Mosley's legacy must mark not just blame, but resolve that every life deserves justice and every alarm must be met with action. 11. John Floyd Thomas. He was John Floyd Thomas, Jr., approximately 72 years old at the time of his arrest in 2009, and worked as an insurance claims adjuster for the State Compensation Insurance Fund. Before the crimes were fully revealed, he lived quietly in Los Angeles, described by coworkers as polite and unassuming, handling paperwork behind a desk. His life offered no obvious clues to what lay beneath. He had endured early losses and disruptions. His mother died when he was around 12 years old, after which he was raised by an aunt and a godmother. He briefly served in the U.S. Air Force, but received a dishonorable discharge. In 1957, he was convicted of burglary and attempted rape and spent nearly a decade in prison following parole violations. This pattern of instability and criminal behavior would silently shadow the decades that followed. What may have triggered his descent into horrific violence is not fully clear, No publicly documented trauma or mental illness appears in his history, but it's evident that he preyed upon older women living alone, exploiting vulnerability and invisibility. His ability to maintain a stable job while living a double life suggests deep compartmentalization and perhaps a chilling sense of control. His known crimes spanned two distinct waves. The first occurred in the mid-1970s in western Los Angeles neighborhoods where he entered the homes of elderly women, sexually assaulted them, and choked them, often covering their faces with pillows or blankets. That wave seemingly halted when he returned to prison. After his release in 2003, a second wave unfolded in Claremont and Pomona Valley with a similar modus operandi. Investigators suspect he may have been responsible for 10 to 15 more murders beyond the 7 for which he was convicted. The breakthrough came with DNA. In 2001, the LAPD launched a cold case initiative to revisit unsolved crimes using biological evidence. Decades-old samples from 2 of the attacks were revived, but no match was found until years later, while seeking the Grim Sleeper detectives collected DNA from Thomas. That sample linked him to multiple crime scenes. He was arrested on March 31, 2009. On April 1, 2011, he pleaded guilty to 7 counts of first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. In court, prosecutors called him possibly Los Angeles' most prolific serial killer. Psychologically, Thomas embodied a predator operating beneath the social radar, exploiting trust and familiarity. There are no published assessments of mental illness or trauma, and his actions cannot be excused. His ability to live a seemingly normal life while terrorizing vulnerable individuals highlights a chilling divide between appearance and reality. There is no justification or sympathy for his choices. His crimes demanded justice, which ultimately came too late for many victims. Families endured years without closure. This story must stand as a warning. Vigilance matters, especially for those society too often overlooks. The memory of his victims deserves our unwavering commitment to justice, empathy, and protection, especially for those living in solitude. Let this serve as a reminder that darkness can walk alongside us undetected unless we refuse to ignore the quiet shadows. 12. Chester Dwayne Turner. He was Chester Dwayne Turner, around 40 years old at the time of his first death sentence in 2007. Working as a pizza delivery man and cook, he lived a quiet and unassuming life, often without stable housing, drifting through Los Angeles neighborhoods. Raised in Warren, Arkansas, he relocated to Los Angeles with his mother at age 5, dropped out of Locke High School, and held low-wage jobs while spending long stretches in homeless shelters. His public image was forgettable, someone on the fringes of society, invisible until the darkest truth broke through the facade. There's no widely published record of childhood trauma or mental illness, yet his life reflects isolation and invisibility, suggesting a deep-seated detachment from societal norms. He spent much of his adulthood cycling through the criminal justice system for minor thefts and parole violations, while something more sinister unfolded in the shadows. Between 1987 and 1998, he sexually assaulted and strangled at least 14 women along a narrow stretch of motels and apartments on either side of Figueroa Street in South Los Angeles and in adjacent corridors. Many victims were sex workers or individuals experiencing homelessness. One victim was pregnant, and Turner was also convicted in the death of her unborn child. His crimes revealed a chilling pattern of calculated cruelty, strangulation for sexual gratification, followed by disposal of victims in neglected urban corners. The investigation broke open when Turner was arrested in 2002 for rape in Skid Row. DNA evidence from that crime linked him to multiple unsolved killings. In 2007, he was convicted of 10 counts of first-degree murder and the death of an unborn child and was sentenced to death. A judge later described his level of cruelty as rarely seen in murder trials. In 2014, a jury convicted him of 4 additional murders: Alandra Bunn, Deborah Williams, Mary Edwards, and Cynthia Annette Johnson, bringing his known victim total to 14. He received a second death sentence emphasizing that justice must account for each victim. During these trials, prosecutors noted the devastating impact on families. One victim's sister spoke of wounds reopened by the process, the reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied, but a wound reopened for healing. There is no excuse or empathy for a man who exploited marginalized women and lived among them unnoticed. Turner's case illustrates how the unseen can conceal the unthinkable. Though his public persona was that of a delivery man quiet in the background, he orchestrated terror across city blocks, all while evading detection for over a decade. This story calls for unflinching accountability. These women deserve more than remembrance. They demand justice, recognition, and unwavering protection for the vulnerable among us. Let the memory of each victim serve as a somber charge to remain vigilant, to speak for those who cannot, and to ensure that no one disappears unseen ever again. 13. Paul Durso. He was Paul Durso, approximately 33 years old at the time of his arrest in 2003, and worked as a cab driver in Jacksonville, Florida. Born in Beaumont, Texas, in 1970, he moved to Los Angeles as an infant. His upbringing appears unremarkable, raised by his mother and extended family. He graduated from Reseda High School and later worked as a security guard before enlisting in the United States Army. He was discharged dishonorably and eventually settled in Jacksonville. His life appeared ordinary and even unsteady, but beneath it lay something far more sinister. There are no public reports of childhood trauma or diagnosed mental illness. Still, his pattern of violence suggests a disturbing detachment. Over time, his domestic life fractured, his marriage was marred by violence, and his wife sought a restraining order amid accounts of assault. This personal instability may have existed alongside a calculated predatory intent targeting vulnerable young women who trusted him enough to let him into their homes. From approximately 1997 to 2003, he murdered 7 young women, 2 of them pregnant, across Georgia and Florida. In each case, he gained access through his cab driver, work-bound the victims, sexually assaulted them, and strangled them with a cord. His victims, or their unborn children, were discovered at various dump sites or inside their homes. One victim, Tracy Habersham, disappeared after dancing with Durso. Her death was not linked to him until much later via DNA confirmation. Investigators broke the case when DNA evidence connected him to multiple murders. On June 17, 2003, he was arrested and charged with 5 first-degree murders. His connection to additional killings emerged through further forensic and circumstantial evidence linking him to earlier crimes. In December 2007, he was convicted for the murder of 24-year-old Tyresa Mack and sentenced to death. Yet, the jury's verdict in favor of capital punishment 10-2 did not meet the state's constitutional requirement for unanimity. In 2017, the Florida Supreme Court overturned his death sentence under newly established legal standards for jury unanimity. He faced resentencing, and in December 2021, a new jury again recommended the death penalty by a 10-2 vote. However, the law still required unanimity, so his sentence was again changed to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Paul Durso's motivations remain speculative. Experts suggest his crimes were born from a mix of domestic instability, opportunity, and a desire for control, all while maintaining an outwardly mundane life. Psychological assessments are not publicly detailed, but the methodical nature of his acts reflects premeditation rather than impulsivity. There can be no sympathy for him. He exploited his position, his proximity, and moments of trust to harm young women, some of whom were taken from families still awaiting answers. His actions demand condemnation and not justification. The memory of his victims calls upon us to recognize how ordinary people, even those we barely notice, can conceal unspeakable violence. Let their stories be our call to vigilance, protection, and unyielding justice. 14. Lonnie David Franklin. He was Lonnie David Franklin Jr., about 64 years old when convicted in 2016, and worked for years as a city trash collector and briefly as a police garage attendant in Los Angeles. Raised in South Central LA, He spent time in the U.S. Army, where he was dishonorably discharged following a violent crime overseas. He settled into a seemingly ordinary routine, married for more than 3 decades, father of 2. Living in a small home beneath that quiet life, something deeply disturbing was concealed. There is no public documentation of childhood trauma or mental illness. His ability to maintain a stable household while allegedly carrying out an unseen reign of terror suggests the presence of a chilling duality, a man leading 2 lives. His crimes appear rooted not in impulsive rage, but in calculated control over victims whom society often overlooked. Between 1984 and 2007, he preyed upon vulnerable young black women across South Los Angeles. Using a .25 caliber pistol, he would stalk victims and kill them, often disposing of their bodies in alleyways or near garbage-strewn areas. An apparent hiatus of approximately 14 years between the late 80s and early 2000s earned him the nickname the Grim Sleeper. He also left chilling souvenirs, photos, and personal items from survivors and victims stored in his garage. Investigators began to piece together his identity through a breakthrough in 2010. A familial DNA match linking crime scene samples to his son led detectives to his front door. Undercover investigators collected DNA from a discarded pizza slice, confirming the match. In July 2010, Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested outside his home and charged with 10 murders and 1 attempted murder. Hundreds of photographs and videos of women were recovered in his home, evidence of his predatory voyeurism. Many of those pictured were unidentified, and the materials were released publicly to aid identification. His trial began in February 2016, and after nearly 3 months of testimony, a jury convicted him in May 2016 of killing 9 women and 1 teenage girl. One survivor, Enietra Washington, testified that she had been shot, assaulted, and left for dead, but lived, and her testimony lent critical depth to the case. In June 2016, the jury recommended the death penalty, and in August he was formally sentenced to death for each victim. Psychological profiling suggests Franklin's crimes were expressions of dominance and degradation committed even while blending into suburban domesticity. Prosecutors argued his actions were driven by power and control, dehumanizing his victims and treating them as disposable. He never faced execution. On March 28, 2020, Franklin was found dead in his cell at San Quentin State Prison. There were no signs of trauma, and the cause of death was not publicly released. Diana Ware, the stepmother of one victim, said his death brought a measure of peace amid enduring grief. His crimes demand unequivocal condemnation. This was not the act of a disturbed soul deserving empathy. It was the calculated violence of a man who exploited society's indifference. Franklin hid in plain sight, perpetrating atrocities against women society had forgotten. Let this narrative stand not as sensationalism, but as a call to justice, awareness, and unwavering protection for those whose voices are too often silenced. The memory of his victims must be honored not only by words, but by action. 15. Wayne Williams. He was Wayne Bertram Williams, around 23 years old at the time of his arrest in 1981, and worked as a freelance photographer and aspiring music promoter. Born and raised in Atlanta to 2 schoolteacher parents, his upbringing was stable and intellectually stimulating. He graduated from Douglas High School and briefly attended Georgia State University before dropping out. To friends and colleagues, he appeared bright, creative, and driven with no obvious signs of menace beneath the surface. What may have prompted him into a position of suspicion remains uncertain. There are no reports of significant trauma or mental illness in his background. Yet the circumstances of the crime suggest a chilling intertwining of opportunity, and proximity targets often included children and young adults from neighborhoods he knew, familiar faces obscured by fear. Between July 1979 and May 1981, at least 28 young black children, adolescents, and young adults were abducted and murdered across Atlanta. The victims, mostly boys, were found in wooded areas or discarded near roads and rivers. Their disappearances and deaths sparked widespread fear and outrage in the city. His first link to this string of tragedies emerged when he was stopped near a bridge after police heard a splash in the river. The driver belonged to him, and 2 days later, one of the bodies emerged there. Investigators gathered critical forensic evidence fibers from his home clothing car, and even his dog were tied to multiple victims. In one case, hair and carpet fibers found on the body of a victim matched unique items from his environment. Witnesses placed him with some victims before their deaths, and his timeline contained inconsistencies. He was arrested on June 21, 1981, charged with the murders of 2 adults, Jimmy Ray Payne and Nathaniel Cater. His trial began early the following year, and prosecutors introduced circumstantial evidence linking him to additional suspected child victims, though he was not formally charged for those deaths. After about 11 hours of jury deliberation, he was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. Williams maintained his innocence throughout. Questions persist among community members, some families, and legal analysts. Some argue that his conviction offered a convenient closure to a traumatic chapter without resolving the broader case. Others have suggested alternative suspects or even alleged law enforcement suppression tied to racial tensions at the time. Still, experts like FBI profiler John E. Douglas believe that while Williams likely committed the 2 murders, he was convicted for the broader child killings probably involved multiple offenders. This story demands firm moral clarity, whether fully responsible or not for all linked deaths. Wayne Williams's conviction compels us to confront systemic failures where vulnerable lives were prematurely dismissed, where the rush to resolution may have overshadowed full truth. No level of uncertainty should soften the devastating impact on families who lost a child without complete answers. Let this narrative serve as both a call for justice and a reminder that clarity requires rigor, not closure alone.